Reactions used to be easy to get. A word, a tone, a small shift, and the empath would respond, not out of weakness, but because they were aware, engaged, present. But something changes. The response disappears. No emotional feedback, no visible reaction, nothing to read or influence. And that's when people get uncomfortable, because without a reaction, there's nothing to work with. No control, no leverage, no way to pull them back into the same dynamic. This isn't distance, it's discipline. The empath hasn't lost feeling, they've gained control over it. And once that control is in place, everything that used to affect them stops working completely. They stop rewarding behavior. The dynamic begins to change when the empath recognizes how much of the interaction has been shaped by response rather than by intent. Attention, explanation, emotional engagement, all of these act as reinforcement. When a behavior is followed by a reaction, it gains value. Not always in a positive way, but in a way that keeps it active. Over time, certain patterns continue not because they are meaningful, but because they consistently receive a response. This realization reframes everything. The empath starts to see that reacting to behavior, even with correction or resistance, still feeds the pattern. A reaction confirms that the behavior reached its target. It shows that something was triggered, that engagement is still available, that the dynamic is still responsive. And once that connection is understood, the role of reaction becomes clear. It maintains what should have already ended. The empath no longer looks at behavior as something that needs to be answered in every instance. They begin evaluating whether responding actually changes anything. If a pattern continues after being addressed, if the same behavior appears regardless of explanation, then responding to it again does not create progress. It only keeps the loop active. That loop is what gets removed. They stop providing immediate feedback to behavior that has already proven to be consistent. Not as a form of withdrawal, but as a way of removing reinforcement. If something repeats without adjustment, it is no longer treated as something that requires attention. It is recognized as part of a pattern that has already been understood. This creates a different outcome. Without reaction, the behavior loses its effect. It no longer produces the same engagement, no longer creates the same level of interaction. The absence of response interrupts the cycle that kept it in place. What once felt like something that needed to be managed becomes something that is allowed to exist without being supported. That absence is not passive. It is deliberate. The empath is not ignoring what is happening. They are choosing not to participate in it. They are allowing behavior to stand on its own without adding energy to it. This removes the layer of influence that reaction provides. This reveals the true structure of the interaction. If behavior changes without reinforcement, then it is dependent on that reinforcement to continue. If it remains the same, then it confirms that responding to it was never going to alter the outcome. In both cases, the need to react becomes unnecessary. What replaces reaction is observation. The empath watches how behavior unfolds when it is not being engaged with. They notice what fades and what persists. They see who adjusts when attention is no longer given, and who continues the same patterns, regardless of the lack of response. That information is more valuable than any explanation, because it shows what exists without influence. The interaction becomes clearer without constant reaction shaping it, patterns become easier to identify, and decisions become easier to make. There is no longer a need to manage behavior through response, when its nature is already visible. This is where control becomes stable, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the removal of reinforcement. They control the timing, not just the response. Control is not limited to what is said or how it is said. It extends to when engagement happens and when it does not. The empath begins to understand that timing shapes the entire interaction, often more than the content of the response itself. When responses are immediate, predictable, and consistent regardless of context, they create a rhythm that others can rely on. That rhythm becomes an entry point. It allows behavior to be directed around it, adjusted to it, and in some cases used to maintain influence. When timing is predictable, access becomes easy. The person on the other side learns that any message will receive attention quickly, that any shift in tone will be met with a response, and that engagement can be initiated at any moment without consideration for the state or priorities of the empath. This creates a pattern where the interaction is no longer balanced. One side sets the pace and the other follows it. Recognizing this changes how timing is used. The empath no longer treats every message as something that requires an immediate response. They allow space between stimulus and engagement. That space is not hesitation or avoidance. It is a deliberate pause that removes the automatic nature of the interaction. By not responding instantly, they prevent the other person from setting the tempo of the exchange. This introduces a new structure. Engagement happens on their terms, aligned with their own state of clarity, rather than driven by external input. If a response is given, it comes from a place of control, not from the pressure to maintain continuity. If no response is given immediately, the interaction remains open without being controlled by urgency. This changes how the interaction is experienced on both sides. For the empath, it creates stability. There is no rush to engage, no need to keep up with a pace that was not chosen. Attention is directed where it is appropriate, not where it is demanded. For the other person, it removes predictability. The expectation of immediate engagement no longer holds, and without that expectation, the ability to guide the interaction through timing disappears. Timing becomes a filter. Those who are used to constant access begin to reveal how they respond when that access is no longer guaranteed. Some adjust, respecting the space and maintaining consistency without needing immediate feedback. Others attempt to reintroduce urgency, increasing their effort to provoke a quicker response or to re-establish the previous rhythm. The empath observes this without adjusting back. They do not speed up to meet external pressure, and they do not slow down as a form of reaction. The pace remains aligned with their own control, independent of how the other person behaves. This removes the feedback loop that once allowed timing to be influenced from the outside. The interaction stabilizes at a level that reflects this control. Conversations either adapt to a more measured pace or they lose momentum if they relied on immediacy to stay active. In both cases, the outcome becomes clearer without requiring additional explanation. Controlling timing does more than change when responses happen. It changes who controls the interaction itself. When timing is no longer predictable, influence becomes limited. Without a consistent response pattern to rely on, there is no clear way to direct engagement or to create the same level of impact through behavior. What remains is interaction that exists within the boundaries set by the empath's control. And within those boundaries, nothing happens by default. They become unreadable. The interaction changes when the empath stops presenting clear emotional cues that can be tracked and interpreted in real time. Earlier, their responses carried visible signals. Tone, expression, timing, and detail all provided information about what they were thinking and how they were feeling. That visibility made it easier for others to adjust their behavior, to test boundaries, and to predict what kind of response they would receive next. Over time, that predictability becomes a tool that others can use, whether consciously or not, to guide the interaction in a direction that suits them. The empath begins to recognize how much information is being given away through those cues. Every immediate reaction, every change in tone, every detailed explanation adds to a pattern that can be observed and learned by someone paying attention. When that pattern becomes consistent, it creates a level of transparency that removes any uncertainty for the other person. They can anticipate reactions, adjust their approach, and maintain a certain level of influence simply by understanding how the empath typically responds. That understanding leads to a controlled adjustment. The empath does not change who they are, but they change how much of that internal process is made visible. Emotional responses are no longer displayed automatically. Tone becomes more neutral. Timing becomes less predictable. The information that once flowed openly through reactions is now filtered before it is expressed. This creates a different kind of presence. Communication remains clear when it needs to be, but it is no longer layered with signals that reveal internal states. There is no excess detail that allows someone to analyze or interpret beyond what is being said directly. The empath is still engaged, still aware, but no longer transparent in a way that can be used to shape the interaction from the outside. Unpredictability becomes a natural result of this control, not in a chaotic sense, but in a way that removes the ability to anticipate how the empath will respond in any given moment. Without consistent cues, the other person cannot rely on previous patterns to guide their behavior. What once felt like a stable and readable dynamic becomes uncertain. This uncertainty changes how the interaction unfolds. Attempts to provoke a reaction become less effective because there is no clear feedback to indicate success or failure. Efforts to adjust tone or approach based on previous responses no longer produce the same outcome because those responses are no longer consistent in their visibility. The usual methods of reading the situation and adapting to it begin to lose their accuracy. The empath is not withholding communication. They are controlling the flow of information. What is necessary is expressed. What is not necessary remains internal. This distinction removes the extra signals that once made their state easy to interpret. Without those signals, the interaction becomes more grounded in what is explicitly communicated rather than what can be inferred. This creates a stable form of engagement that does not depend on being understood through observation of reactions. The empath remains consistent in their own behavior, but that consistency is no longer presented in a way that can be easily mapped or predicted. It exists internally, guiding their decisions without being exposed through automatic response. For someone who relied on reading those cues, this feels like a loss of clarity. In reality, it is the removal of access to information that was never required for the interaction to function properly. What remains is communication that stands on its own, without the additional layer of emotional visibility that once made it easy to interpret. And without that layer, the dynamic can no longer be directed in the same way. They stop being the emotional center. The interaction changes when the empath no longer carries the responsibility of stabilizing the emotional tone for everyone involved. In many situations, they naturally became the point where tension was processed, where confusion was clarified, and where imbalance was corrected. This did not happen through obligation, but through awareness. They could read the environment, understand what was off, and adjust their response to bring things back into alignment. Over time, this created a structure where others relied on that presence without fully recognizing it. That reliance becomes visible when it is no longer supported. The empath begins to notice how often they are the one maintaining clarity, how frequently they are the one smoothing over inconsistencies, and how much of the interaction depends on their ability to interpret and respond in a way that keeps everything stable. When that pattern repeats across different situations, it reveals a dynamic where emotional balance is not shared, it is managed. Managing it requires continuous input. Every shift in tone, every misunderstanding, every moment of tension requires attention. The empath monitors, adjusts, and responds in a way that keeps the interaction from becoming unstable. This process can hold everything together, but it also creates a dependency. The interaction begins to rely on one person to keep it functional. Once that dependency is understood, the role begins to change. The empath no longer steps in to regulate every fluctuation. They do not immediately correct tone, they do not absorb tension to neutralize it, and they do not take responsibility for maintaining emotional balance that is not being maintained by others. This is not withdrawal. It is the removal of a role that was never meant to be permanent. Without that role, the interaction is forced to stand on its own. If the other person can maintain consistency without relying on external regulation, the connection remains stable. If they cannot, the imbalance becomes visible without being corrected. What was previously hidden by constant adjustment now appears clearly. This clarity changes how engagement continues. The empath no longer feels the need to intervene every time something becomes uneven. They allow the interaction to reflect exactly what is present. If tension arises, it is not immediately resolved through their effort. If confusion appears, it is not automatically clarified by their explanation. The responsibility is no longer carried on one side. This creates a different experience for the other person. They are no longer interacting with someone who absorbs and processes everything for them. They are interacting with someone who allows the exchange to remain as it is. This can feel unfamiliar, especially for those who were used to having their emotional state stabilized without having to contribute to that stability themselves. The absence of that support reveals behavior more accurately. Some will adjust and begin to maintain their own consistency. Others will continue expecting the same level of regulation and become unsettled when it is not provided. In both cases, the outcome becomes clear without needing to be explained. The empath remains present, but not as the center that everything moves around. They engage without carrying the entire structure. They respond without correcting everything. They participate without managing every emotional variable in the interaction. What changes is not their awareness. What changes is how that awareness is used. It is no longer directed toward maintaining balance for others. It is directed toward maintaining clarity for themselves. They filter what even reaches them. Control over reaction begins earlier than the moment a response would normally occur. It starts at the level of what is allowed to enter attention in the first place. when everything is noticed and processed automatically. Every tone, every message, and every small shift has the potential to create a response. This creates a constant stream of input that keeps the empath engaged, even when engagement is not necessary. With awareness, the person begins to recognize that not every input deserves processing. Some communication is repetitive. Some behavior follows patterns that have already been understood. Some interactions carry no new information yet still demand attention through habit. Allowing all of this to reach the same level of focus creates unnecessary load. It keeps the mind occupied with signals that do not require interpretation, and it maintains a level of involvement that no longer serves a purpose. The response to this is not withdrawal from interaction, but control over exposure. The empath begins to decide what receives attention and what does not. This decision is not based on emotion at the moment. It is based on patterns that have already been observed. If something has shown itself to be consistent in a way that does not change, it is no longer processed as if it were new. This reduces the volume of what actually reaches them. Messages that would have triggered immediate analysis are seen for what they are without being fully engaged. Tones that once required interpretation are recognized quickly and then left without further attention. Behavior that repeats without variation is no longer examined in detail. This is filtering at the level of perception. What is unnecessary does not move forward into deeper processing. It is acknowledged and then allowed to pass without creating internal activity. This prevents the buildup of reactions that would have followed if everything was given equal importance. The effect of this is stability. When fewer inputs are processed at a deep level, there are fewer triggers for reaction. The empath is no longer responding to every signal because most signals do not reach the point where a response would be formed. This creates a controlled environment internally, where attention is directed only toward what carries actual relevance. This also changes how others experience the interaction. Attempts to provoke a reaction often rely on reaching the person's attention in a way that creates immediate processing. When that pathway is filtered, those attempts do not reach the same depth. They are noticed, but they do not activate the same level of engagement. This makes the empath appear unaffected. The input was simply filtered before it could create a reaction. This becomes consistent. Only information that meets a certain level of relevance is allowed to move forward. Everything else remains at the surface, without influencing behavior or creating unnecessary response. This removes the constant pressure to engage with everything that appears. The interaction becomes more selective without becoming disconnected. What matters is still recognized and addressed. What does not matter is not given the same level of access. This creates a clear separation between presence and over-involvement. Presence remains. Over-involvement is removed. And without over-involvement, reaction becomes controlled rather than automatic. They remove the expectation of response. A predictable response pattern teaches people how to interact with you. When every message receives attention, when every tone shift is addressed, and when every attempt at engagement produces a reply, an expectation forms. That expectation becomes part of the structure of the interaction. It tells the other person that access is reliable, that engagement will continue, and that any effort to reach you will be met with a response. This expectation turns into certainty. The person on the other side no longer questions whether a response will come. They assume it will. That assumption gives them a level of control over the interaction, because they can initiate contact and rely on the fact that it will be continued. The pace, the frequency, and even the direction of the exchange can be influenced simply by knowing that a response is guaranteed. Once this pattern is recognized, it becomes clear that expectation is what keeps the interaction active. The empath understands that as long as responses remain consistent and predictable, the dynamic will continue in the same way. It does not matter what is being said or how it is being said. The continuation of the interaction depends on the certainty that engagement will follow. Removing that certainty changes everything. The empath no longer responds automatically. They do not engage with every message, and they do not maintain a steady pattern that can be relied on. Responses are given when they align with intention, not when they are expected. Silence becomes part of the interaction, not as a reaction, but as a neutral outcome when engagement is not necessary. This introduces uncertainty into the dynamic. The other person can no longer predict when or if a response will come. The expectation that once guided their behavior begins to weaken. Without that expectation, their ability to direct the interaction through repeated engagement is reduced. This does not create confusion for the empath. It creates clarity because without the pressure to respond, attention is no longer pulled by every attempt at interaction. The empath decides when to engage based on relevance, not on obligation. This removes the constant demand to maintain the connection through continuous response. The interaction either adapts or fades. If the other person adjusts to the new structure, respecting that engagement is not guaranteed. The connection can continue in a more stable form. If they rely on the expectation of response to keep the interaction active, the lack of consistent replies causes the dynamic to lose momentum. The empath does not intervene to maintain it. They allow the interaction to reflect exactly what is being offered without adding additional effort to sustain it. This is not avoidance. It is the removal of a pattern that created unnecessary dependence on response. Without that pattern, the interaction becomes more accurate. It is no longer driven by expectation. It is defined by what both sides are willing to contribute without relying on certainty of engagement. What remains is a connection that exists without the need for constant response to keep it alive. And without that need, control over the interaction returns to the person who chooses when to engage, not to the one who expects a reply. When reaction disappears, control ends. Control inside an interaction is often built on one simple factor: the ability to predict and influence a response. When someone knows how you react, how quickly you respond, and what kind of emotional feedback you provide, they gain a level of leverage without needing to state it directly. That leverage does not require force. It operates through repetition. A certain tone produces a certain reaction. A certain behavior creates a predictable outcome. Over time, this becomes a structure that guides the interaction. The empath begins to recognize that this structure exists not because of what is being done to them, but because of how consistently they have responded in the past. Each reaction provided information. Each response created a pattern. Each engagement reinforced what would happen next. That pattern becomes a map. Anyone paying attention can follow it. They can adjust their behavior to produce a desired response, or at the very least, to maintain engagement. The interaction stays active because the feedback loop remains intact. As long as reaction is present, the loop continues to operate. Once the reaction is removed, that loop breaks. The other person no longer receives confirmation that their behavior has reached its target. There is no visible adjustment to read, no emotional signal to interpret, no clear indication of impact. Without that feedback, the ability to guide the interaction begins to weaken. This is not about silence for the sake of silence. It is about removing the mechanism that allowed influence to exist. Without reaction, there is no reliable way to test boundaries. Attempts to provoke, to engage, or to shift the dynamic no longer produce consistent results. The same input does not lead to the same output, and without that consistency, the interaction cannot be directed in the same way. This creates a different environment. The empath is still present, still aware, but no longer participating in the feedback loop that sustained the previous dynamic. Engagement, when it happens, is controlled and deliberate. It does not follow a predictable pattern that can be used to guide behavior. What becomes visible is the absence of influence. The other person may increase effort, trying to re-establish the pattern that once worked. They may change tone, adjust approach, or introduce new behavior in an attempt to generate a response. But without consistent feedback, those adjustments do not produce the same level of control. The interaction either stabilizes in a new form or loses its structure entirely. If it stabilizes, it does so without reliance on predictable reaction. If it loses structure, it reveals that the connection depended on that reaction to function. In both cases, the outcome is determined by what remains when influence is removed. The empath does not need to enforce this change. It happens naturally through the absence of response, because control requires feedback to operate. And when feedback is no longer available, control has nothing to attach to. Reacting stops making sense, not because there's nothing to feel, but because not everything deserves a response. An empath reaches a level where emotion is no longer automatic, where presence isn't easily pulled, where silence becomes more precise than reaction. And that shift changes everything. Because once reactions are no longer available, the usual ways people influence, provoke, or engage stop working. This isn't distance, it's control. Control over attention, over energy, over what gets access and what doesn't. So if an empath no longer reacts the way they used to, don't mistake it for disconnection. It's the moment they stop being affected and start deciding what affects them at all.